In the harsh windswept mountains of Dagestan, where the cold molds boys into men, a child quietly began carving his name into the bones of combat history. Khasavyurt was not a place of dreams, it was a place of survival. Yet within its freezing streets, a boy found purpose not in comfort, but in the fire of discipline. He wasn't the loudest nor the biggest, but even as a child there was a current beneath his calm demeanor, something focused, unshakable. Zabit Magomedsharipov didn't rise through privilege or fortune. He rose because he had no other option but to climb. His childhood was shaped by movement, fluid, hungry, obsessive movement. While other children played, he studied motion. Not academically, but viscerally. Whether it was football or freestyle wrestling, he sought to understand rhythm, space, timing. He didn't just enjoy sport, he dissected it. And when he stumbled across combat training, it wasn't a revelation, it was recognition. He had found where his energy belonged. At 10 years old, he began training at the 5 directions of the world, a name that would eventually come to symbolize the angles from which he would strike in the cage. This wasn't a casual hobby, it was a rite of passage. Every morning brought aching limbs and long treks. Hours spent walking through unforgiving terrain just to reach the mat. Cold fingers on steel door handles, breath visible in the air. He carried his training gear on his back like a monk bore scripture. No cameras, no promises, just repetition. His parents worried for his education, his safety, but he never deviated. And when the family's concerns threatened to derail his path, an uncle stepped in, pulling strings, making arrangements, and helping Zabit secure a place at a martial arts boarding school. There, he passed every test with ease, not because the challenges were simple, but because he was prepared to break under the weight if it meant growth. What followed were years in a cramped dorm with other hungry warriors. The space was so small it earned the nickname, The Cave. But Zabit didn't mind. To him, it was a sacred place. It echoed with effort, determination, and quiet purpose. He trained under Zabit Magomedsharipov, a man known for forging fighters the way blacksmiths forge blades. Discipline wasn't taught, it was lived. Zabit, surrounded by boys stronger and older, rose through the ranks, not through intimidation or trash talk, but through sheer will. His weapons weren't words, they were timing, composure, and clarity. As others focused on glory, he focused on form. In those early years, his commitment narrowed like a funnel. Football faded, even academics dimmed. All that remained was wushu sanda, a fluid, brutal fusion of striking and grappling arts. It wasn't just a martial art, it was a philosophy of motion. Zabit immersed himself in it. The way he moved began to change. He no longer telegraphed his intent. Every motion became bait or misdirection. His limbs turned to whips, his body an unpredictable silhouette. He began winning, first local, then national, then international, Russia, Europe, the world. Every stage he entered, he left with gold, but more importantly, with evolution. He studied each opponent not as a threat, but as a mirror to improve himself. And while the trophies piled up, the hunger remained untouched. Despite his achievements, he stayed reserved. Media attention hovered nearby, but he ignored it. Sponsorship offers were deflected, interviews declined. While others practiced their walkouts and nicknames, Zabit trained. He remained allergic to spotlight, uninterested in fame. He didn't need to be known, he needed to be ready. In 2012, he stepped into professional MMA. It wasn't the beginning of his journey, just the next natural step. His debut was in Odessa. His opponent, a Kazakh fighter with more experience. But experience didn't prepare for what Zabit brought. He entered the cage like a painter enters a studio, calm, unhurried, purposeful, and when the moment arrived, a spinning back fist ended the fight. It wasn't brutal, it was surgical. The crowd hadn't expected art, but they received a masterpiece. There was no celebration. He walked away as if he'd merely completed a round of drills. That debut didn't launch a hype train. It planted a seed, a whisper across gyms, a quiet clip shared in hushed tones. Watch this guy. He fought again 2 months later. The bout was quick, dominant, and largely undocumented, lost to the cracks of time that often swallow the early struggles of future legends. There was no major crowd, no highlight reel, only another page turned, another lesson learned. He moved to Pro FC for his third bout and faced Abubakar Yusupov. The environment was different, the stakes slightly higher, but the result echoed the same. Zabit didn't brawl. He dissected. He played with distance, controlled the center, struck with precision, and when the fight hit the ground, ended it with a submission that seemed premeditated. He wasn't absorbing damage. He wasn't scrambling for advantage. He fought like a man who already knew how the fight would end. Calm eyes, precise movement, no wasted energy. After every fight, he returned to training, not to polish the techniques he used, but to sharpen the ones he hadn't yet revealed. His fourth opponent was a rugged fighter from Dagestan named Abov Atayev. Zabit began the fight with spinning kicks so quick they seemed to defy gravity. Elbows, back fists, and flying knees followed. The audience stopped cheering and started watching. This wasn't violence. This was demonstration. His opponent tried to respond, but each attempt was smothered with an answer faster than it formed. Atayev endured, but that's all he did. There was no doubt. By round 2, it was a formality. The punishment continued, measured, relentless. Zabit nearly ended it with an armbar, but the round expired. When the second began, it was the same script continued. Eventually, the referee stepped in. Another body added to the tally. Another performance that wasn't about destruction, it was about clarity. His fifth fight came against a powerful striker, Igor Egorov. This time, the stakes were clear. Egorov was experienced, brutal, and feared in the hand-to-hand circuit. But Zabit brought rhythm. He moved like music, slipping punches, stinging with kicks, retreating and re-entering with perfect timing. But in a rare moment, his rhythm cracked. He allowed an opening, and Egorov capitalized. An armbar, a loss, his first and last. For any other prospect, it might have been the moment of unraveling. For Zabit, it was recalibration. He absorbed the defeat not as a wound, but as a sharpening stone. It confirmed something he needed to feel, that losing wasn't death. It was data. It was clarity. 5 months later, he returned. A new promotion, a new mindset. Against Sergei Sakhayev, he reminded everyone why he was different. 3 kicks came his way. He evaded, waited, then countered with a flurry. On the ground, he floated from position to position, then secured a choke. The opponent didn't resist long. The ninja had returned. From there, the destruction resumed. Samat Hadalov, another tough opponent, walked into the storm and never found the exit. Zabit controlled every aspect, his techniques landing with textbook clarity. Each round ended with him in control. No drama, no doubt, just command. As the calendar turned to 2014, he stepped into ACB, the Absolute Championship Berkut, a league packed with rising killers and hardened veterans. This was not the place for pretenders. Zabit didn't enter quietly. He entered explosively. Against Oleg Zamanov, he revealed a new layer. When the fight hit the ground, it was Zabit who executed the takedown. He transitioned, struck, then finished the bout with a choke that left no room for doubt. He was no longer just a striker. He was becoming something terrifying, something complete. The ACB Grand Prix pushed him further, forcing him into battles with seasoned veterans who had fought in wars long before his name ever appeared on a poster. His semifinal opponent, Artak Nazarian, was a grappling specialist with years of experience. He came in with confidence, but the moment the cage closed, that confidence began to erode. Zabit didn't rush. He flowed. He evaded every takedown, slipped every clinch, and countered every attack. His striking, already revered, had evolved. It wasn't just volume, it was violence layered with patience. Nazarian tried to adapt, but it was like chasing wind. He attempted to close the distance. Zabit punished him with precision. When he finally overcommitted, he was dropped, not once but twice. The referee called a halt before the damage could grow too severe. Zabit walked away without a mark, his face blank, unreadable. The roar of the crowd never touched him. What mattered was the clarity of execution. In the Grand Prix final, he faced Abdulrahman Temirov, an undefeated submission artist with 10 finishes to his name. A man known for violence, for grit, for unbreakable pressure. As the cage door locked, Tamirov extended a glove and then immediately shot for a takedown, a deceptive tactic, but Zabit didn't flinch. He reversed the attempt, secured position, and within seconds, snaked in a choke. The undefeated streak died in silence. Zabit stood up, untouched, unshaken, unconcerned. There was no emotion, only stillness. He was now the Grand Prix champion, and with the belt came weight. Not the physical kind, but the type that whispers to a fighter between fights, about expectations, about doubts, about what's next. The online discourse had started circling him like buzzards. Not about skill, not about talent, but about cardio. Analysts, fans, critics. Everyone wondered if the storm that struck early could last in a longer war. Zabit didn't respond. He listened, processed, and returned to work. In March 2016, he received the opportunity to silence the questions. A 5-round title fight in ACB, a real belt, a real test. Sheikh Magomedov stood across from him, strong, experienced, and dangerous. A man trained by the Ahmat fight team. 5 rounds were scheduled, but Zabit needed only 1. He pressured early, never allowing Magomedov to settle. Jabs snapped like ropes. Kicks spun and slammed like thunder. Then came the head kick, fast, clean, final. The champion had arrived, and he didn't need the championship rounds to prove anything. His first title defense came against Vinicius Silva, a Brazilian with solid wrestling and knockout power. But Zabit finished the fight in under 2 minutes. A spinning kick to the body dropped Silva. Ground and pound sealed it. Another bonus. Another storm. And with that, the conversation shifted. He was now seen not just as a regional kingpin, but as a global problem. Coaches in the West began to ask each other if this Dagestani phantom could survive on the UFC's biggest stages. He wasn't grinding out decisions. He was finishing dangerous men with techniques few dared attempt. While many fighters used belts to leverage attention, Zabit stayed grounded. He kept winning, kept training, and let others shout into microphones. He had one final fight on his ACB contract. Behind the scenes, UFC scouts had already taken notice. Promoters were watching. His name had begun to slip into conversation alongside the world's best. He didn't rush. He didn't beg. He waited. Precision had always been his compass, not ambition. In 2017, the doors finally opened. He left Dagestan for the United States, not as a star or even as a UFC fighter, but as a sparring partner. In New Jersey, California, and Las Vegas, he trained with champions. He made little noise, asked no favors, and gave everything. Word began to spread in gyms that rarely overreacted. They spoke of a fighter who could glide across the mat, mix strikes and submissions with unnatural fluidity, and never lose composure. Veterans who sparred him walked away saying the same thing. This one was special. When his UFC debut was announced, few outside the hardcores recognized the name, but those inside the sport leaned forward. He fought Mike Santiago in Rotterdam. The lights didn't shake him. The moment didn't weigh on his shoulders. He looked like a man running errands, not entering the biggest stage of his life. When the cage closed, it was the same storm from ACB. Spinning kicks, flying knees, level changes, and transitions smoother than silk. Santiago was overwhelmed, submitted in the second round. The UFC handed Zabit his first performance of the night bonus. The MMA world began to pay attention, but attention never interested him. While the internet erupted, Zabit returned to the gym. No callouts, no headlines, just movement. The UFC offered him Artem Lobov next. It was a perfect contrast. Lobov, the talker, the brawler, the showman. But the fight never happened. Instead, Zabit was matched with Shimon Moraes, a tough Brazilian striker. The bout wasn't just a win, it was a performance layered in mastery. Over 3 rounds, Zabit dominated with timing, creativity, and control. He submitted Moraes just before the final bell. Another finish, another bonus. Momentum was now a wave he couldn't escape. Fans speculated, fighters whispered, analysts asked, how far could this guy go? But Zabit never entered that conversation. He just trained. The UFC finally gave him a spotlight. Kyle Bochniak at UFC 223 in April 2018. The fight was meant to be another showcase. Instead, it became a war. Zabit won the first 2 rounds easily. His strikes landed from angles that left even commentators confused. But Bochniak didn't break. He absorbed everything and kept walking forward. By round 3, it was chaos. The kind of raw, blood-soaked brawl that reminds fans why they watch this sport. Bochniak threw wild punches. Zabit responded with fire. They stood in the center of the cage, trading not just strikes but wills. When the final bell rang, the crowd erupted. Zabit had won clearly, but Bochniak earned respect. And Zabit had answered another question. He didn't just have skill, he had heart. The fight was named Fight of the Night. Dana White posted clips. Fans called for ranked opponents. The aura had begun to crystallize. Zabit wasn't just an artist, he was a problem with depth. But still, the UFC didn't offer the names he wanted. The long-awaited fight with Yair Rodriguez was announced, teased, and then dissolved again. Injury, delay, rumor. And in the chaos, Zabit remained silent. He accepted a replacement, Brandon Davis, a fighter with no ranking, little fanfare, and no reward. But Zabit never looked for reward. He took the fight, stepped into the cage, and created a moment that would become part of UFC folklore. In round 2, he caught Davis in a Suloev stretch, a rare and brutal submission that twisted the leg at impossible angles. The tap was immediate. The reaction online was explosive. Another win, another highlight, another bonus. Zabit, again, walked away without celebration. His rise was no longer questioned, it was inevitable. He was now climbing the rankings, slowly, without drama. Every performance added weight to his legend. But it was never just the finishes. It was the manner in which he fought, with elegance, with control, with a silence that made opponents doubt themselves before the first punch. In 2019, the test arrived. Jeremy Stephens, a veteran known for knockout power, pressure, and grit. If Zabit faltered here, the hype would dissolve. If he prevailed, the top 5 would no longer be out of reach. They met in the cage. Stephens came forward with bombs. Zabit evaded, countered, slipped, spun. He turned the fight into a clinic of movement and timing. He didn't just survive, he dictated. For 3 rounds, he proved he belonged with the best. The decision was unanimous. Stephens looked frustrated. Zabit, as always, looked untouched. He didn't scream into the microphone. He didn't leap onto the cage. He left quietly, as if the job had simply been done. And the climb continued. The win over Stephens positioned Zabit on the edge of title contention. His record was flawless, his highlights were viral, and his reputation among coaches had become mythic. But while the world expected him to start making noise, to scream his place into the conversation, Zabit remained silent. He didn't chase microphones. He didn't fire shots on social media. He simply sharpened his weapons, waited for the next opportunity, and let the pressure swirl around him without ever stepping into its center. The long-anticipated showdown with Yair Rodriguez was rebooked, announced with anticipation, billed as a meeting of unorthodox minds. Fans salivated over the thought of spinning kicks, unpredictable angles, and chaos forged in creativity. But fate intervened once again. An ankle injury took Rodriguez out. No backup was offered. No plan B, just silence. Zabit went home with nothing but frustration in his hands and a storm still bottled inside him. Months passed. The UFC moved on, feeding the machine with new names, new drama, new narratives. Zabit, once the hottest featherweight in the world, began to vanish from the spotlight. Not because he was forgotten, but because he never played the game to begin with. In a sport where attention often outweighs achievement, he was a ghost, present only in the form of highlights and questions. Then came the booking that would become the beginning of the end. Calvin Kattar in Moscow. The bout was initially scheduled for 5 rounds, but shortly before the event, it was changed to 3. No explanation, no clarity, just adjustment. Many whispered that Zabit's team had requested the change. Others speculated it was the promotion. But the reason didn't matter. The perception did. Because from the opening bell, Zabit did what he always did. He controlled. He dazzled. He dictated range with sniper-like precision. Spinning kicks, jabs, body strikes, movement that seemed choreographed not for violence, but for elegance. The first 2 rounds were his. Kattar struggled to land anything meaningful. He stalked forward but 8 counters for every attempt. Zabit's eyes remained calm, his steps deliberate. But as the 3rd round opened, the pace began to shift. Qatar surged. Zabit slowed. The gas tank, always a lingering question, seemed to drain just enough for doubt to enter. Qatar began landing. Zabit retreated more often. The exchanges turned closer. The margin of control narrowed. The final bell rang with Zabit still ahead. The decision was unanimous, and rightfully so. But for the first time, there was no afterglow, no celebration, no sense of elevation. Instead, there was a strange quiet, a recognition that while Zabit had won, he had also revealed a fracture. The whispers about his cardio weren't going away. They were growing. And beneath the surface, something else had started to fracture. His body. What fans didn't see was that the elegant storm had begun to suffer. A spasm in his diaphragm affected his breathing. Shoulder injuries limited his movement. Clavicle pain throbbed through training sessions. The cage had stopped being a stage and started becoming a burden. He kept training, kept trying, kept pushing against the current. But something inside him knew. His body was betraying the spirit. The UFC attempted to rebook the Rodriguez fight one last time. The same matchup that had loomed for years. It was announced again. Then again, it was pulled. No replacement, no backup. The calendar turned, and Zabit's name remained in limbo. His ranking began to fade. The UFC didn't strip him publicly. They didn't make an announcement. They just stopped mentioning him. Quietly, without tribute, they erased his name from the top 5. The fans noticed. The hardcore faithful posted tributes. Highlight reels resurfaced. Clips of the Suloev stretch, the head kick knockouts, the dance against Stevens. They asked where he had gone, why he wasn't fighting. Rumors spread, some true, some speculative. Retirement, health problems, disillusionment. But from Zabit, there was nothing. No statement, no complaint, just silence. And then, in the summer of 2021, the confirmation came. Not with a press conference or a documentary, but with a quiet post. Zabit Magomedsharipov had retired from professional MMA. He didn't rant. He didn't point fingers. He simply stated the truth. The body could no longer carry the weight of the war, and the promises of title shots, of marquee fights, had never materialized. He walked away not in bitterness, but in resignation. Not defeated, but finished. He was 30 years old, undefeated in the UFC, still regarded by many as the most gifted striker in the division. And yet, he was gone. The MMA world reacted not with anger, but with sadness. Fighters, coaches, analysts, they all echoed the same sentiment, that a once-in-a-generation talent had left before the masterpiece was complete. Zabit wasn't remembered for his belt count or title reign. He was remembered for how he made people feel when he fought. The tension, the anticipation, the breath held in the moment before the spin. He didn't fight to win rounds. He fought to create moments. His departure left behind a gap no one has truly filled. The division moved on. Champions changed. New contenders rose. But Zabit's shadow still lingered. Every time a new prospect spun into a kick or landed a submission from nowhere, someone would mention his name. Not as nostalgia, as a watermark, a standard. Because what he represented went beyond technique. He was proof that violence could be graceful, that control could be beautiful, that not every warrior needed to roar. After retirement, Zabit didn't seek media tours or analyst roles. He returned to Dagestan, to family, to the same dirt roads that raised him. He began coaching, pouring knowledge into the next generation. To them, he wasn't just a retired fighter, he was a master, a living blueprint. Not because he had conquered the world, but because he had walked away from it with his soul intact. He never chased fame, and when it found him, he never let it change him. He once told a reporter that he just wanted to raise animals and live quietly. And now, in a world that values noise, he lives in silence, surrounded by mountains, wisdom, and peace. The same fighter who once danced through storms now walks with calm purpose, passing on what he knows, shaping warriors who understand that fighting is not just a job, it's a philosophy. His name is still spoken in gyms, but not with urgency, with reverence. the way monks speak of scrolls, the way artists speak of brushwork. Zabit had never needed a belt to prove he was different. He had always been different. And that difference, that strange, spiritual calm in the chaos, is what defined him more than any victory. In the world of MMA, legacies are usually measured by numbers. How many fights, how many defenses, how many finishes. But Zabit's legacy can't be counted. It can only be felt. In the chill that hits a room when his highlights play, in the quiet that follows his name, in the knowing glance between coaches when a fighter does something beautiful and someone whispers, Zabit. Zabit didn't disappear because he lacked greatness. He disappeared because greatness wasn't enough to survive in a sport that demands more than mastery. He wasn't built for headlines, he was built for truth. A quiet truth expressed through movement, angles, and restraint. He never craved the lights, and the lights never defined him. Even when he was inside the UFC cage, spinning into techniques others didn't dare attempt, he moved with the grace of someone untouched by ego. And that's why his departure felt more like a whisper than an exit. There was no decline, no final knockout, no visual end. Just a perfect round that stopped without explanation. He never asked to be understood. He never tried to explain himself. And yet, people understood him more deeply than most fighters. Because when he fought, something deeper surfaced. An intention, a code. There was never any meanness in his victories, never gloating in dominance. Even when he broke his opponents mentally, he lifted them up physically. His eyes didn't celebrate the damage. They mourned it. He didn't hunt knockouts to entertain. He sought clarity, clean strikes, clean exits. He fought with empathy. While others screamed into microphones, Zabit whispered into history. His name wasn't carried by algorithms. It was carried by gym walls and hushed conversations between trainers. In the training rooms of Dagestan, his story isn't told with exaggeration. It's passed down like scripture. This is how you move. This is when you strike. Watch here. This is where he disappears. They play his fights like film study, not for violence, for rhythm, for understanding. And across the world, others followed. From American boxing gyms to Muay Thai camps in Thailand, his name entered the lexicon. Young strikers stopped practicing only the basics. They began drilling spins, feints, off-angle jabs, foot traps, not to copy, to understand, to get closer to that unseen rhythm he moved within. In Brazil, a jiu-jitsu coach rewound a sequence from the Stevens fight a dozen times, not for the finish, but for how Zabit set the trap. In Indonesia, a group of teenage fighters studied his transitions, trying to move through space without resistance. He wasn't just a fighter, he was a concept. His fights became tools for learning, his highlights, holy texts. Coaches would pause sparring sessions and say, "Move like Zabit," and no one asked which Zabit. There was only one. His style became a watermark of elegance. Not flashy, not desperate, just intentional. And in a sport where desperation often fuels performance, his clarity stood alone. Even fighters with more accolades found themselves drawn to him, some with championship belts, some with losing streaks. All of them fascinated by how effortlessly he turned chaos into control. They watched him not because he won, many fighters win. They watched because he made fighting feel like something pure, not sport, not spectacle, but an art that was somehow sacred again. Zabit had been born in the same rugged mountains as other Dagestani warriors, but his expression of that legacy was different. Where others drove opponents into the ground, Zabit lifted them into uncertainty. He didn't drown them in pressure, he made them question physics. Where others broke fighters with pace, Zabit broke them with silence. His discipline was the same, but his execution belonged to another realm entirely. And in that contrast, he gave MMA something rare, a bridge between brutality and beauty. He proved that a fighter could be dangerous without being wild. He could be disciplined without being robotic. He could be spiritual without being soft. He embodied a balance that seemed impossible until he showed it. And then, suddenly, it became obvious. Of course, fighting could look like this. Of course, violence could be graceful. Of course, stillness could carry power. He didn't change the sport through volume. He changed it through vibration. through an energy that pulsed under the surface of every performance. That's why, years after his last fight, the footage still stirs something. It doesn't just excite, it lingers. You don't forget a Zabit fight, you carry it. Because in a sport defined by short memories and fast turnarounds, he left something behind that doesn't fade. It waits. In highlight reels, in training rooms, in the pause between strikes when a fighter hesitates and thinks, what would Zabit do here? His absence only made the legend grow. Without defeat, without scandal, without decline, he became something timeless, frozen not in a fall, but in flight. He left as he fought, light on his feet, vanishing mid-motion. And that's what made it so haunting. He could still fight, still win, still outclass the best, but he chose not to. That choice rewrote everything. There's a kind of power that doesn't come from winning belts or headlining pay-per-views. It comes from knowing when to walk away and doing it while you still have more to give. Most fighters stay too long. They chase closure. They chase relevance. Zabit chased neither. He knew the rhythm of his story, and when the beat shifted, he exited in tempo. Now when a young fighter lands a rare submission or a spinning strike, fans don't ask, was that from Zabit? They say, that was Zabit. His name has become shorthand for innovation, for control, for mastery. Not the kind measured in statistics, but the kind that lives in memory. He became the fighter others are compared to, not the one they aspire to surpass. Because surpassing Zabit isn't about records. It's about understanding a rhythm few ever feel. His students call him Ustaz now, teacher. But what they receive from him goes beyond instruction. They're inheriting an energy, a way of thinking, a silence between movements, a truth that's difficult to describe but easy to feel. He doesn't teach them how to win rounds. He teaches them how to own moments, how to understand space, how to remain calm while others rage. In his presence, they don't learn to become fighters. They learn to become expressions. In that quiet gym in Dagestan, something is being passed on, not a style, not a technique, but a legacy of presence. Zabit was never loud, but what he gave to the sport still echoes, in jabs disguised as breaths, in transitions no one sees coming, in the pause before a strike that lands like a sentence with no wasted words. This is when you strike. Watch here, this is where he disappears. They play his fights like film study, not for violence, for rhythm, for understanding. And across the world, others followed. From American boxing gyms to Muay Thai camps in Thailand, his name entered the lexicon. Young strikers stopped practicing only the basics. They began drilling spins, feints, off-angle jabs, foot traps, not to copy, to understand, to get closer to that unseen rhythm he moved within. In Brazil, a jiu-jitsu coach rewound a sequence from the Stevens fight a dozen times, not for the finish, but for how Zabit set the trap. In Indonesia, a group of teenage fighters studied his transitions, trying to move through space without resistance. He wasn't just a fighter, he was a concept. His fights became tools for learning, his highlights, holy texts. Coaches would pause sparring sessions and say, "Move like Zabit," and no one asked which Zabit. There was only one. His style became a watermark of elegance. Not flashy, not desperate, just intentional. And in a sport where desperation often fuels performance, his clarity stood alone. Even fighters with more accolades found themselves drawn to him, some with championship belts, some with losing streaks. All of them fascinated by how effortlessly he turned chaos into control. They watched him not because he won, many fighters win. They watched because he made fighting feel like something pure, not sport, not spectacle, but an art that was somehow sacred again. Zabit had been born in the same rugged mountains as other Dagestani warriors, but his expression of that legacy was different. Where others drove opponents into the ground, Zabit lifted them into uncertainty. He didn't drown them in pressure, he made them question physics. Where others broke fighters with pace, Zabit broke them with silence. His discipline was the same, but his execution belonged to another realm entirely. And in that contrast, he gave MMA something rare, a bridge between brutality and beauty. He proved that a fighter could be dangerous without being wild. He could be disciplined without being robotic. He could be spiritual without being soft. He embodied a balance that seemed impossible until he showed it. And then, suddenly, it became obvious. Of course, fighting could look like this. Of course, violence could be graceful. Of course, stillness could carry power. He didn't change the sport through volume. He changed it through vibration, through an energy that pulsed under the surface of every performance. That's why, years after his last fight, the footage still stirs something. It doesn't just excite, it lingers. You don't forget a Zabit fight, you carry it. Because in a sport defined by short memories and fast turnarounds, he left something behind that doesn't fade. It waits, in highlight reels, in training rooms, in the pause between strikes when a fighter hesitates and thinks, what would Zabit do here? His absence only made the legend grow. Without defeat, without scandal, without decline, he became something timeless, frozen not in a fall, but in flight. He left as he fought, light on his feet, vanishing mid-motion. And that's what made it so haunting. He could still fight, still win, still outclass the best, but he chose not to. That choice rewrote everything. There's a kind of power that doesn't come from winning belts or headlining pay-per-views. It comes from knowing when to walk away and doing it while you still have more to give. Most fighters stay too long. They chase closure. They chase relevance. Zabit chased neither. He knew the rhythm of his story, and when the beat shifted, he exited in tempo. Now when a young fighter lands a rare submission or a spinning strike, fans don't ask, was that from Zabit? They say, that was Zabit. His name has become shorthand for innovation, for control, for mastery. Not the kind measured in statistics, but the kind that lives in memory. He became the fighter others are compared to, not the one they aspire to surpass. Because surpassing Zabit isn't about records. It's about understanding a rhythm few ever feel. His students call him Ustaz now, teacher. But what they receive from him goes beyond instruction. They're inheriting an energy, a way of thinking, a silence between movements, a truth that's difficult to describe but easy to feel. He doesn't teach them how to win rounds. He teaches them how to own moments, how to understand space, how to remain calm while others rage. In his presence, they don't learn to become fighters. They learn to become expressions. In that quiet gym in Dagestan, something is being passed on. Not a style, not a technique, but a legacy of presence. Zabit was never loud, but what he gave to the sport still echoes. In jabs disguised as breaths. In transitions no one sees coming. In the pause before a strike that lands like a sentence with no wasted words. He didn't need the UFC to validate him, and in time the UFC will realize that he validated them. He reminded the sport of what it could be, not what it often is. Not the trash talk, not the drama, not the marketing machines, but the purity, the possibility, the edge of what's real. Zabit's story didn't end with a roar. It faded like a myth dissolving into mist. There was no final round, no slow decline under the weight of age or punishment. He didn't lose a step, he stepped away. Not because he wasn't good enough, but because he refused to give any less than everything. And when his body could no longer match the purity of his intent, he let it go. That's what makes his legacy so unshakable. It's not what he achieved, it's how he left it untouched. He became the greatest what if in modern MMA. What if he had gotten the 5-round Qatar fight? What if the bout with Yair Rodriguez had happened? What if he had fought Max Holloway or Alexander Volkanovski? The possibilities are endless, but none are necessary. Because the truth is, his legacy didn't require closure. It required only memory. And memory is what he gave, in abundance. Every performance, a chapter. Every strike, a line. Every exit from the cage, a silent punctuation mark. Other fighters come and go, measured by wins and losses, by how long they held belts or how many defenses they logged. But Zabit left something else behind, a feeling, that shiver in the crowd before he moved, that quiet awe among coaches who didn't even try to explain what he was doing, that silence during replays where commentators ran out of words and just watched. That's what made him different. Not what he said, but what he made others feel. His highlights are studied like artifacts, not because they were flashy, but because they were impossible to categorize. He broke rules not with rebellion, but with understanding. He didn't defy the system to be edgy. He simply moved on a different frequency. That's why even years later, when his name appears online, the response is never lukewarm. It's reverent. Stillness surrounds him even now, not from absence, but from presence that refuses to fade. The belt he never held, it's passed through many hands since he walked away. And still, none of them erase his shape from the division. His absence left a silhouette, one defined not by what he conquered, but by what he represented. He wasn't chasing thrones. He was creating standards. And that's why his legend didn't shrink with time. It expanded. With each passing event, each new champion, each rising prospect, the question lingers louder. Who moves like that? Who controls like that? Who understands like that? He exists now more as a reference point than a competitor. Like Zabit, they say, when a fighter tries something bold. But none truly match it, because it wasn't just the techniques, it was the timing, the control, the ability to make high-risk moves feel inevitable. That ability can't be taught. It can only be embodied. And Zabit embodied it in silence, without showmanship, without explanation. That silence became his signature. His brief UFC career, 6 fights over 2 years, still overshadows the longevity of many champions. Not because he did more, but because he did enough. And in that short window, he redefined what a complete fighter could look like. He wasn't a striker with good defense. He wasn't a grappler with decent hands. He was fluid, complete, a hybrid that no one could solve and few could even understand. And now as he coaches, his legacy is spreading in another way. Through the students who absorb not just his knowledge, but his philosophy. He teaches them not to copy his style, but to listen for rhythm, to respect silence, to see space not as distance, but as opportunity. These lessons aren't given in lectures. They're demonstrated in movement. And in time, one of them will carry that lineage into the cage. Not with Zabit's name, but with his presence. When that moment comes, the MMA world will recognize it. Not through highlights, through atmosphere, through that same strange stillness that once accompanied his walkouts, the quiet tension, the breathless expectation. That was Zabit's true gift, not just performance, but anticipation. He made people lean forward. He made them wait for beauty and violence. And then he delivered it. He once said he just wanted peace, to live simply, to train, to breathe clean air, to stay close to the land that raised him. And now he does exactly that. He walks through Dagestan not as a star, but as a presence. People greet him with quiet respect, not because he demanded it, but because he earned it. He didn't burn bridges when he left. He simply walked past them. And when he looks back now, it's not with regret, it's with clarity. He didn't need the world to understand his choices. He didn't fight for their approval. He fought for something internal, something quiet and ancient. And when it no longer aligned with the system, he bowed out without a word. That choice, that restraint, is what made him eternal. Most careers are judged by how they end. Zabit's is judged by how perfectly it paused. And that pause echoes in every corner of the sport. In every gym where a young fighter tries something creative. In every film session where a coach rewinds his fight and just says, "Watch again." In every conversation where his name comes up, not with marketing spin, but with a kind of reverence usually reserved for the long retired. That's what happens when you become more than a fighter. You become a question that never leaves. Zabit didn't retire as a champion. He retired as a reminder that martial arts at its core is not about dominance, it's about mastery. It's not about conquest, it's about control, and not control over others, control over self. He had that control in abundance, and when he realized the cage no longer aligned with his body, his path, or his peace, he let it go. The memory of his movement lives on in shadow, not in the bright lights of main events, but in the quiet corners of gyms, in the way a student hesitates before throwing a strike, in the way a coach nods at clean footwork, in the pause between rounds where everyone seems to agree, this is how it should look. Zabit's myth isn't built on volume, it's built on vibration, a quiet energy that hums beneath the surface of the sport. And as long as there are fighters who seek more than victory, who seek truth, elegance, expression, his name will never fade. He was the storm that left no wreckage, the artist who stepped back before the paint dried, the warrior who walked away before the wars could change him. And that, more than any belt or bonus, is why his legacy endures. Because Zabit Magomedsharipov wasn't just a fighter, he was a standard, and that standard still stands.